A Takata airbag inflator was supposed to save you in a crash. In the crisis that buried this supplier's US business in Chapter 11, that hidden part could become the threat. The failure mode was brutally simple. Takata ammonium nitrate inflators could rupture, and when they ruptured, metal fragments could spray into the vehicle cabin. That is the click promise of this story. Not a flashy car brand scandal, not a single bad dashboard light, but a safety device turning into a shrapnel risk. The recall expanded to tens of millions of US inflators, and in 2017, Takata's US subsidiary entered Chapter 11. The question is how a component most drivers never saw could grow from a technical defect into a corporate graveyard case. To answer it, start where the driver starts, hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, trusting that the part hidden in the steering wheel will only appear at the worst possible moment and only to protect them. The important thing about Takata is that most drivers did not shop for it. They shopped for a car. They noticed the badge on the hood, the feel of the wheel, the safety rating, the price, the paint, the things a buyer can see. Takata lived deeper in the chain. This is why the case belongs in a corporate graveyard channel. The subject is not one consumer car brand, it is the supplier whose parts sat behind many visible brands, inside a system where the customer often never learns the supplier's name unless something goes wrong. That makes the inflator image so unsettling. It is not a dramatic object, it is a small technical module, the kind of part that looks too boring to carry a company-ending story. But in a safety chain, boring is the promise. If one upstream part fails, the automaker may be the face the customer sees, but the supplier can still absorb the existential damage. Takata was hidden, and that invisibility made the coming failure harder to see until the recall paperwork started forcing the name into public view. That is the supplier trap. When the part works, the brand relationship belongs mostly to the automaker. When the part fails at public scale, the supplier name can suddenly carry the crisis even though the supplier was never the name on the key fob. An airbag is one of those products people trust without thinking about it. You do not test it before buying the car. You do not inspect the inflator on a weekend. You do not ask whether the chemistry inside the module will behave perfectly years later. The whole bargain is that the system stays invisible until the instant it is needed. At that instant, the inflator turns a folded piece of fabric into a deployed safety device. It has to act fast, and it has to act safely, because the driver has no backup plan in the middle of a crash. That is the uncomfortable part of the Takata story. The customer-facing promise was calm and absolute. If the crash comes, this hidden mechanism helps protect the cabin. But the supported failure mode points in the opposite direction. The same hidden module could rupture. The same place where protection was supposed to begin could become the point where danger entered the cabin. Before the recall became enormous and before Chapter 11 entered the story, the trust problem started inside that small technical part. Here is the core mechanism, kept narrow because this story does not need invented motives to be alarming. Takata's ammonium nitrate inflators could rupture. A rupture is not just an airbag that fails to appear. It is the metal container itself breaking in a way that could send fragments into the vehicle cabin. That is why the NHTSA-hosted ruptured inflator evidence matters more than any generic crash image. It shows the physical center of the case, damaged inflator hardware, and ejected shrapnel. The surprise is that the feared object is not outside the car. It is not another vehicle. It is not a road hazard. It is a component installed for protection, sitting near the driver, waiting for the moment when every fraction of a second counts. This is the first reset in the story. The crisis was not simply that airbags might fail to work. The darker version was that the rescue device could become a projectile source. Once that is the mechanism, the next question changes. You are no longer asking whether a supplier can fix a part, you are asking how many hidden parts are already out in the world. The phrase ammonium nitrate inflator also matters because it keeps the danger attached to the actual component instead of drifting into vague fear about all airbags. The sourced claim is specific. These Takata inflators could rupture, and the rupture could turn metal hardware into fragments inside the cabin. The next stage looks boring on purpose. It looks like official paperwork, recall titles, customer notices, and technical language. But in this case, the paperwork is where the hidden defect becomes visible. A recall bulletin about a Takata driver's airbag inflator is not just a document. It is the moment a private supplier problem enters a public safety process. The words matter because they move the risk from engineering rooms into mailboxes, service departments, vehicle owner searches, and public databases. A driver may never understand the chemistry inside an inflator, but they can understand that the driver's airbag inflator is being called back into the spotlight. This is the strange texture of a recall crisis. The evidence arrives with bureaucracy instead of drama. The page is clean, the stakes are not. Behind the flat language sits the same physical problem, an inflator that could rupture and spray metal fragments. The document makes the story official, and once the story is official, every next layer becomes harder for the supplier to contain. Then the scale changes the entire story. A supplier can survive many ordinary defects. It can replace a batch, negotiate with a customer, absorb a painful cost, and move on. The Takata case stopped looking like that because the recall expanded to tens of millions of US inflators. Stay with that phrase because the scale is the midpoint shock. Tens of millions of components already installed, already distributed through the vehicle fleet, already tied to drivers who may not know the supplier's name. At that size, the problem is no longer one model, one customer, or one service campaign that disappears after a few weeks. Scale multiplies everything. It multiplies replacement logistics, customer trust problems, legal exposure, public communication, and pressure on the supplier's ability to survive the crisis. This is the midpoint rehook. The frightening part is no longer only the rupture. It is that the fix has to chase a hidden component across a massive installed base. The dangerous part is small. The recall footprint is not. Every notice and replacement effort has to find a real vehicle, not an abstract part number. That is why a small module becomes a massive operational problem. The risk is hidden in individual cars, but the response has to be organized across a national recall field. This is where the clean module from earlier changes meaning. At first, it looked like a small technical part. In the official evidence, the viewer sees ruptured Takata inflators and ejected shrapnel. The same type of object has gone from hidden hardware to public proof. That contrast is the turning point. A supplier can explain a defect in technical language, but damaged metal tells the story faster. It collapses the distance between abstract recall language and the cabin where a driver sits. The viewer does not need an invented scene or a dramatic reconstruction. The official visual evidence already carries the point. The component meant to support a safety system could break in a way that introduced metal fragments into that same protected space. Once the failure is visible and the recall is measured in tens of millions of US inflators, Takata is no longer managing a small repair story. It is managing institutional loss of trust. And for a hidden supplier, trust is almost the whole business. If customers never chose you directly, they may only learn your name when they learn what failed. The title payoff arrives in 2017. Takata's US subsidiary entered Chapter 11. That fact is easy to say, but it changes the shape of the story. Chapter 11 is not the same thing as a recall bulletin, and it is not the same thing as a technical image of broken hardware. It is the corporate consequence layer. The defect story, the recall scale, and the public safety process have reached the balance sheet world where a company has to deal with the cost and structure of survival. The NISA-hosted customer notification tied to Takata Chapter 11 communication is a useful bridge because it shows both realities touching the same viewer. On one side, there is the safety issue that still has to be addressed. On the other side, there is a supplier in bankruptcy proceedings. The late rehook is this. The recall did not stop just because the US subsidiary entered Chapter 11. Dangerous parts still had to be found, communicated about, and replaced. The company story and the public safety story were now moving on different clocks. Chapter 11 does not make the inflator safer by itself. It changes who is trying to manage the obligations while the safety process continues. That is what makes the customer notification layer so important. It shows that bankruptcy communication and recall communication had to share the same public stage. That is the aftershock that makes the Takata case bigger than a normal business failure. A company can enter a bankruptcy process on a date. A safety recall does not become finished just because the corporate story hits that date. Tens of millions of US inflators means a long tail of notices, repairs, checks, reminders, and public communication. The recall bulletin and the bankruptcy notice show two parallel realities. One reality is mechanical and immediate. A driver's airbag inflator may need attention because of a rupture risk. The other reality is corporate and procedural. The supplier's US subsidiary is in Chapter 11. For the ordinary driver, those realities collide in a very practical way. The part is still hidden in the vehicle. The paperwork may be the only visible trace of the risk. And the name Takata, once invisible behind the dashboard, now follows the owner through notices and recall instructions. That is why this is not only a supplier finance story. The recall outlived the clean ending that a business headline would prefer. The business lesson is sharp because it does not require pretending we know more than the sourced record says. The visible brand on the vehicle is not always the company whose component creates the deepest risk. In safety-critical industries, a small hidden module can carry a gigantic exposure because the module sits inside a promise customers cannot personally verify. They trust the automaker trusts the supplier chain. The driver trusts that every invisible link has held. Takata matters because that trust chain broke around a mechanism that could rupture and send metal fragments into the cabin, and the recall expanded to tens of millions of US inflators before the US subsidiary entered Chapter 11 in 2017. Final rehook. The scariest corporate failure is not always the flashy product flop people can laugh at from a distance. Sometimes it is a trusted part nobody notices until it breaks. The company does not need a famous retail storefront to become famous for the wrong reason. It only needs one safety-critical mechanism to fail at massive scale. This is also why the case is not just a warning for airbag suppliers, it is a warning for any business that sells trust through another company's product. If your component is invisible, your margin for failure may be invisible too, right up to the moment the defect becomes public evidence. So return to the first image, a normal driver, a steering wheel, an airbag hidden from view. That driver is not thinking about ammonium nitrate, recall scale, supplier exposure, or Chapter 11. That is exactly why the Takata story works as a corporate graveyard case. The danger lived in a part that was supposed to be forgettable. The recall became enormous because the part was already out there, installed across tens of millions of US inflators. And the corporate consequence landed because a hidden supplier's name became attached to the failure of a safety system. Takata's US subsidiary entered Chapter 11 in 2017, but the legacy of the case is not just a bankruptcy fact. It is the reminder that in safety-critical products, the smallest invisible component can carry the largest corporate risk. The part nobody sees can become the part everyone remembers. And the next corporate graveyard story may already be hiding behind some other product people trust every day.